thorough, and it is the definition of the conductor, who is not necessarily a scholar in the Bible. And so I'm here because I want to learn. And the second reason is that I have become a couch potato during COVID, and I can sleep until 10 in the morning, and I don't think that's good for me. So I'm making myself do morning activities. So the extra 15 minutes it takes to get here and get me up earlier, that's good for me. It's good for my health.
Sleeping till 10 sounds good to me.
Pardon?
Sleeping until 10
Oh,
sounds good to me.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
I'm Bonnie Hattersley. I go to CUMC, and I'm recently retired after working for 38 years. So I'm glad not to get up at 5 a.m.
As what?
as an engineer. So I get up at 7 a.m. every day.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I really like this opportunity now to do Bible studies that I couldn't really participate in anymore. And I did read the whole New Testament during the second year of COVID. But yeah, I actually had been wanting to reread Romans. Another pastor had mentioned, how key it is.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I'm going to reread it. But then I saw your notice for the Bible study. I was like, oh, well, this is perfect.
Yeah. It's the way I look at it is, if you take away Romans from the Bible, if it did never exist, most of our theology is gone. We get most of our theology from Romans, and so it's kind of a critical part of who we are. So, yeah.
Okay, I guess I could talk. I'm Diana. I've been going to Christ Church by the Sea since I was 29. Before that, I was Episcopalian and flirted with taking Catholic instructions a few times up at Berkeley. I retired, in 2007 as a school psychologist, counseling coordinator, and homeless liaison. And I still work privately a bit, not too much because I don't want to. So I've been leading the meditation services once a month at Christ Church by the Sea, which were designed by Pastor Paul, for the community that identifies as spiritual and not particularly religious, although I've been known to slip in. I structure it so people who come in Christian, I can do it for them and me. So, I realized when Brian asked me if I wanted to do this, I don't really know Romans at all. So that's good.
That'll be fun then.
Yeah. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you. Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm Ben. I've been through fundamentalist theology since till I was a teenager and started dating. And then I I ended up at a Methodist church, and I've been one forever. I retired twice in my life, in 2005 and again last year, but different jobs. I'm here because, I've been in Bible study since 78? At our church, we've had a continuous Bible study going. And it involved recently, it's now more into the background, etc. We've gone through the Bible a number of times. And while I realize Romans is important, I thought it's good time for a refresher course. That's where I'm at. Susan, my wife Susan.
Anyway, I kidnapped him and made him be a Methodist. I could not stand the church he went to. It was bad from my perspective. Anyway, I made
Just because they wouldn't let you speak during the services?
No, They made, when we had
Oh.
just had
I remember that.
our son, and it was Mother's Day. And Pastor Britton had all the mothers come down in front of the church and say and be forgiven for being evil or whatever. I don't know. I stopped listening to him about halfway through that. And I told Ben I was never going back there again.
She loves to be embarrassed in front of a crowd.
Oh,
especially.
yeah, it was terrible. I just couldn't even
Recommit
believe it.
themselves to Christ.
Yeah, it was recommit yourself to Christ, give me a break. And, you know, if you were there, I don't know, it just hit me the wrong way, and anyway. But meanwhile, we've been, obviously have been married and et cetera, so. Anyway, but we've always been going to Methodist churches, and as Ben said, we've done 104 Bible study classes and from different perspectives. And that's good. And a review of Romans will be great.
So this is 105 then?
Yeah. Got it.
Were you ever at First UMC or no?
No,
That's what I thought, but I want to
when
verify.
we moved in to our house in 1974, it was
January 1.
the
Oh, wow.
gas prices thing. And you could only buy gas every other day. So when we moved, Ben, of course, being the person he is, drew a circle around the nearest Methodist church to see where we could
For
go
my
to church.
work.
Yeah, basically to see where he was working, and then we found the church, which is 3 blocks from our house.
That's very methodical of you because
I
you're
thought it
Methodist.
Well, that was really the superficial thing. The reality was, we went and tried several churches and really enjoyed the warmness and activity that were going on at Mesa Verde at the time.
Yeah.
We had over 300 members and lots of things taking place, a lot more events when we had kids. Now we don't have as many kids, so we don't have those opportunities. So, but anyway, and it had a great pastor at the time.
All right. All right, cool. Thank you. I will say one more thing. Bruce from First gave me the directory from like the 70s, and I open it up and it has Susan Shaw right there looking at me. And I'm like, I know that's not the same Susan because you weren't with Ben, but it just made me laugh. I'm like, wait a minute. Anyway, all right, Bonnie.
Sorry, trying to get my Bluetooth device to work. I'm Bonnie Berger. I'm from First UMC and from Christ Church by the Sea. I was raised Catholic, and all my catechism classes focused on the Old Testament, oddly enough. So, and I've read the New Testament bits and pieces, little Bible study classes, self-taught, blah, blah, blah. So I'm really excited to do this because the Bible is, of course, inerrant and completely consistent throughout all
Yeah.
33,330,000 verses. I'm just kidding. So I'm excited to learn a little bit more about this and what was going on at the time.
And we will do that. We will kind of do a dance between now and 2,000 years ago, and kind of and some of the stuff that happened in between. I think I'm gonna move the camera a little bit closer so that you can see us better, since there's just 3 of us. That's okay with everybody? Unless I break the cable.
Wow.
I should introduce you all to Boots because he's going to be interfering a lot. Boots is the cat.
Boots is gonna make an appearance.
All right.
Yeah, he's already interfered. Okay.
Oh
Boots.
yeah, I can hear it. Yeah. Okay, so for today,
Well,
we're not gonna do this much going forward, if at all. This is not my style, but I made a PowerPoint to kind of guide our first conversation a little bit. And the idea is that I want to get a foundation before we actually jump into Romans. So we're all somewhat on the same page. And so I'm going to go through that. And what it's going to be is it's going to be a combination both of like traditional ways of thinking about Paul and reading Paul, but then also throwing in some, well, what about now? What's some of the scholarship that's happening now? And how does that reshape the way we think? Oh, I forgot something in my car. That's okay. We'll get there. It's on the slideshow. All right, let's see here. I want to share screen. Share. I love that I'm on two different computers because I don't have to ask, can you see that? I know that you see that. So we're going to be talking about kind of assumptions that have been made about Paul, some of our assumptions, and what are different assumptions that we can bring to Romans that then kind of reshape how we think about what we're reading. Because you can read one verse and think about it a million different ways depending on where you're coming from and what kind of your set of assumptions are. And we'll get to that. You'll see some of that today, but it's really going to come out as we go forward through all of Romans. The plan is to read all of Romans together. And by the end, I think what I want to do is, as we go, rewrite the NRSV version with some of the assumptions that we're working with so that we have an alternative translation to work with. Because a lot of the stuff that we're going to be doing and talking about isn't in the NRSV. And it's because NRSV is like from what, the 70s or 80s or something like that, maybe even earlier. And so there's a lot of work that's been done since then, and kind of coming to it with a fresh view and saying, oh,
Oh,
Paul might be talking about this differently.
I have a huge question.
Already?
I had Bibles. I gave my latest Bible to my granddaughter who just got baptized, and she's already back at Berkeley. And I gave my other really nice Bible to a homeless fellow I was working with who asked for it. So the only Bible in this house right now is the Jerusalem Bible. So I need to get a Bible.
Just steal one from the church.
Yeah,
There's plenty there, right?
they have extras. We hand them out sometimes.
Yeah, and
I'll
going forward, I'll have my Bible with me. I don't have it, but I don't really need it necessarily today.
And the only Bible I have at home is the King James.
Which would be really interesting to do a comparison.
Yeah.
Any of these other versions, it'd be interesting to read and say, oh, wow, like that completely skews how we read this or how we think about this. And we'll talk about that some as we go. But really, translations vary so much. It almost guides, it really does in a lot of ways guide the way that you're thinking about what you're reading. Like you don't necessarily even have a choice to see it another way because of the way it's written. All right, so as we go forward, not today, but as we're reading Romans, the actual text, I'm going to have some guiding questions. They're on some big pieces of paper, but I'll also put them in the chat, I think, each week. And there are going to be moments where I'm going to point to these questions and say, what about this question relate? Like, how does this scripture or this passage relate to this question? So the first one is, who is Paul addressing? And generally, when we as Christians read the Bible, who do we think the Bible is talking to? Us.
Yeah.
Right? And so the assumption is Paul is writing to us as Christians. But if you go back 2,000 years, would Paul have understood himself doing that? And if the answer is no, how does that reshape the way we approach Romans? How does it shift some of our assumptions? And then, so I bring up Jews and Gentiles because a lot of times we'll think, oh, Paul is talking to Jewish folks and saying, you don't count anymore. When in reality, the likelihood is he's talking to non-Jews, i.e. Gentiles. So Gentile is a term for everyone who's not Jewish. It comes from the Greek ethne, where we get like the term ethnicity from. And so the idea is Paul's saying everybody else. There's the Jews and then everybody else. And a lot of times he's trying to figure out what is the relationship for all of these other people, the Gentiles, in relation to the God of the Israelites, Yahweh.
So he wrote deliberately to the two different groups at different times in Romans?
No, so in Romans, and we'll get there when we start reading it in the first chapter, he specifically says, I'm writing to the church in Rome, and I'm the apostle to the Gentiles there.
Gotcha.
Meaning, I'm talking to the Gentiles right now.
Gotcha,
That's
okay.
who I'm addressing. Now, at times, he's going to be talking, and so we'll get there in a sec. How does that shape our understanding and why? So I've kind of already talked about that. Is it reshapes how we approach the text and what we do with it? And then the question is, who is Paul talking about or with? So there, while he could be writing to the Gentiles, he could be talking about Jewish folk.
Oh, okay.
And at times, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, at times he's talking to a specific Jewish person in the letter, kind of like when you're a stand-up comedian and you play two roles and you're going back and forth. But when we read Romans and we read the text, we don't have, as modern readers, we don't necessarily see that. Whereas ancient people would have understood it immediately what was happening, particularly because Paul didn't write Romans. He spoke it out loud.
Mhm.
And he had a scribe, a person that would write it down, and then that scribe would take the letter to a church, so the church in Rome, and read it, and they would be literally playing it out. So that they would immediately say, oh, this is a person that Paul is talking to, but it's not a real person. It's a hypothetical person.
Okay.
And sometimes they're Jewish. So Paul is talking with a Jewish person, but he's talking to Gentiles. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Mhm.
How does this passage relate to all of these different concepts? So justice. And justice, a lot of times we think about justice today in terms of like, in the face of structures, resisting those structures and trying to change the world and trying to change the way in which the world works. But there's also God's justice, which is a different thing. So Paul is thinking about the justice of God, and at times he's questioning whether or not the things that have happened are just. Is God a just God? And what he's trying to do a lot of times, and we'll see this through Romans, is he's trying to attempt to see the world in a way in which God is just. And a lot of it has to do with the Israelites, the Jewish folks being the chosen people, despite not having done anything. Why do they get to be chosen and the Gentiles, everybody else, are just kind of SOL, they're just kind of off to the side and not having done anything, they're on the outs. And Paul's like, that doesn't really feel just. So he's trying to like jump through some hoops to make it so that God is just. Faithfulness, we'll get into this the next session. But there's a conversation around our faith in Jesus. And that's a lot of times how Christians will talk about it. We have a faith in Jesus. But Paul might be talking about something else, which is the faithfulness of Jesus. So Jesus doing the thing. And we'll talk about the Greek of that later. And it really shifts. There's a dramatic shift in how we read someone like Paul if we think about it as belief in versus, or faith in versus faithfulness of. That small shift in wording completely changes our relationship to Jesus and to God and what that looks like. Law, are there any questions so far? Law, I have in quotation marks because I think we can recognize today that there are many different types of law. So there is the law that the government creates. There's natural law. And then in this context, in the ancient Jewish world, there's Jewish law, so the Torah, and we'll read Romans and Paul will be talking about the law, but we have to think, which law is Paul talking about? Is he talking about Jewish law here? Is he talking about natural law? Is he talking about the law of the empire, the Roman Empire? And it could shift, and if we select a different option, we have to think through, how does that change how we're thinking about what Paul is saying? There could be a dramatic shift if Paul's talking about Jewish law versus Roman law. And also, the law in relation to whom? So I think we can recognize, for the most part, that in the United States, there are laws that are written in a certain way that they don't apply equally to everybody. That was true then as well. And when we're talking about Jewish law, there's a question of whether or not Jewish law should be applied to Gentiles, to the nations, to everybody else. And so we have to think about, okay, what law is Paul talking about, and in relation to whom? Because you can make the argument, like, what if Paul is saying the Jews should be following the law, but everybody else shouldn't be? Like, he's saying, don't go get circumcised. He's not telling Jews that, he's telling Gentiles that. And there's a reason why, and we'll get to that. But like this law thing, you can see how there's a lot of layers to these terms that we have to be considering as we go. Salvation, righteousness, and justification, we'll get to. There's some nuances there. It doesn't make sense to talk about that necessarily right now. Well, that's like a later kind of stuff to handle. But these are, as we're going, these are things that we're going to be bringing up and kind of returning to. These themes are things that we're going to return to consistently as we read Romans. And so I'm going to have them, for those that are here in person, they're going to be on big pieces of paper. They're in my car. I left them there on accident. I'm sorry. But they're the exact same questions written down so that we have them easily accessible as we're going. And then the hope, and hopefully you all will help me do this, is that like the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll stop and think about how does this, either the passage or what we've talked about, relate to our own personal faith? Does it change it? Does it make it stronger? Does it make you rethink anything? Just how does it relate to your faith, and what do we do with that? And so 15 minutes may not be enough, but we'll figure that out as we go. We'll play around with it. Any questions about the questions?
That's a meta question.
It is a meta question, yes. Cool. Additional key terms and ideas.
Uh-oh, can you move that over somehow?
I can. Oh, I have to do it on there. Thanks. One moment.
Okay. Whoop.
Sorry. I hear a cat.
What do you want, Boots? I'm doing something. Romans, Christianity.
Okay, so the image off to the left was very purposeful. It's from a place in Turkey that I don't remember how to say the name. That's okay. But as you can see, it's a menorah, and then a cross was added later above it. And so the idea here that I'm thinking about is, how does Christianity relate to Judaism, and how does it come out of it?
It was added later. I thought it was done at the same time. To
No,
make a point of
it
some
was
sort.
added later. And so this is on a pillar of one of the temples. And so we can think of this is effectively graffiti on a pillar at a temple. Yeah. Romans, I'm going to assume everybody knows what Romans is, but also at the same time, I'm not.
It's a letter that Paul wrote to the people living, or the churches in Rome.
Correct.
That's what I know.
Correct. We'll run with that.
Okay.
Now, there are other layers to that. So in a lot of Paul's letters, he's writing to churches and responding to some type of crisis that they're in. He's saying, stop doing that. You shouldn't be doing that thing. Paul is kind of doing that in Romans, but he's also, it's a theological discourse. He's really thinking about, how does God work? And he doesn't necessarily do that as much in the other letters. It's more about, how do you act in community? He does get into some of that in this letter, but really it's here's how we're supposed to think about the role of Jesus in our faith. So it's a letter, but it's also like there's a term for it, not a theological treatise, but something else. Anyway, it's very theological in nature, where the other ones aren't necessarily as much so. So when we're reading Romans, we have to remember, one, this is to a specific community, to specific people, but it is also more broad than that, because he's thinking about larger issues. Paul, I'm just going to assume you know who Paul is. Guy walking around, writing letters, founding churches.
What years?
Romans was written between 55 and 57, I want to say. And Romans is the very last letter that we get from Paul. We never hear from Paul again after Romans. and we don't know what happened to him. We can talk about Acts and we'll get there. But realistically, Paul himself, we don't hear from again. Yeah, so this is the end for Paul, for us. Christianity versus Jesus movement. This is a very like nuanced thing that happens in academia, but it also matters here. So we have a lot of time, like within the church, we think about, oh, Paul was Christian and you had the Christian church back then. By and large, they were Jews. They were still Jewish through and through. They saw Jesus as a Messiah figure, but they were still fully Jewish. So like if you read Acts at the beginning, they're still going to temple and still worshiping at temple. They're still fully Jewish. And so we talk, like in academia, we talk about as the Jesus movement, because it's more so just a movement within Judaism that's occurring, that's happening. And that can shift how we think about Paul's relationship to Jews. It's almost like he's having an internal debate within Judaism. At times he's bickering with other Jews. We see this with Peter. He and Peter do not get along, and they have very different thoughts on how the church or how this early Jesus movement should function, and it causes problems. But yeah, think of it as a Jewish movement within Judaism. Law, Torah, nomos, we already talked about that. This just different ways to think about law. Nomos is the Greek word for law. So thinking about like Roman law and the laws of wherever these people may be, which is different from Jewish law. Any questions? I swear it's not going to be like this going forward. This is just, we're getting a foundation together. Septuagint and Paul. Does anybody know what the word Septuagint means?
No,
Septa sounds like a number in Latin.
It does. It does sound like a number in Latin. It may be.
It
I don't
means
know.
seven books.
7 books.
First 7 books of the Torah.
Yeah,
think.
so it's what we call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Paul read that not in Hebrew, but in Greek, because he was fully Greek. He walked around, he was schooled in Greek schools. And a lot of times what happens in academia, and sometimes it's talked about at church, but not that much. It's almost like we understand there to be a complete separation between Judaism and the rest of the Greco-Roman world. But if you're walking around, speaking the language, eating the food, reading the things, partaking in daily life, you're Greek.
I sorry, that's one of the things I did not know. I thought he was another Jewish man.
He is a Jewish
Beginning.
man, but he's also Greek.
Oh, a Jew raised in Greece.
I can't remember where exactly he was raised, but he was in the Roman
All right, okay.
Empire, and what's the term that's used? It's like ubiquitous. You can't get out of it. It's always there. So like if you think about our modern context, a group of people that attempt to be completely separate are like Amish folks, right?
Mhm.
Amish folks want to exist outside of the world, like outside of, like they don't use electricity, blah, blah, blah. This last summer, we went on a big road trip. We were in Durango, Colorado. We went to a pizza place and we're hanging out, and all of a sudden we're just surrounded by a bunch of Amish folks that are eating pizza and hanging out with us.
oh,
They didn't drive there, but they're still partaking in daily life. So it's the same thing. It's like, yeah, they're separate,
Yeah.
but they're not really different
yeah,
fully. And what happens is part of that separation is an attempt to self-identify over and against something else. So it's a process of like creating identity to say we are different from you, even though we still partake in that life. They're still going to like the baths, which this is why circumcision matters actually, because when you go to a Roman bath, everybody's naked and hanging out together, and they can see
Mhm.
that you're Jewish.
Mhm.
That is a physical marker, and they can see that you're Jewish, is that you're circumcised. It wasn't weird for them to see people naked. That was like part of normal world for them. But they're still going to the bath, to the Roman bath. They're
Mhm.
still there in the space, partaking in it.
Okay.
So that, yeah. Let's see. Reading as Jew or Christian. So thinking about think about reading Romans from either a Jewish perspective or a Christian perspective and how that changes how we understand what Paul is saying. But also, a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about and a different way to think about Romans and read Romans comes out of Jewish folks, Jewish academics that started reading Paul and realizing this guy's Jewish. And then all of a sudden within New Testament studies, people are like, oh yeah, you're right. So the fact that Jews were willing to go read Paul and then have this realization of this dude's not Christian, he's Jewish. And then we have a whole different way to think about Paul and what Paul's doing in the letter to Romans and other letters as well. Questions about that?
They were upset that he was Jewish?
No.
Surprised?
Surprised
Pleased?
and when reread realized he's not bashing Judaism at all. He's doing something else because, and we'll talk about this some later if we get to it, but like Paul in some ways is the father of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism.
Really?
Yeah,
Hmm.
because
You just said Paul's not bashing Judaism.
right,
So-
but he becomes the father because that's the way people read him.
Oh.
So there's who Paul actually was versus how he was read and understood. And so over time, he's read more and more in a way that this dude's Christian, he's broken from Judaism, and they read Paul saying, the Jews did not accept Jesus, so they're on the outs now.
Hmm.
Okay.
When these Jewish folk reread it and say, Paul's not saying that. He's saying they're still covered by the original covenant with Abraham, and they're still the chosen people. It's just now there's another route that adds everybody else in, which is, spoiler alert, it's Jesus. But that doesn't negate the relationship the Jewish folks and the Israelites already had with God. But thousands of years of interpretation have kind of stamped that out. Particularly Christian interpretation have stamped that out. And it's getting rediscovered when these Jewish folks are reading and be like, oh no, y'all been doing it wrong this whole time. Y'all have been reading this wrong the whole time.
Well, let me ask you a question. So in the Roman Empire, what
Yeah.
percentage were Jewish and,
Tiny, very tiny.
yeah, like, okay,
And they were kicked out. So if you go to Rome, by the Colosseum, it's the Arch of Titus.
yeah,
And when you look at, I can't remember if you look at it from underneath, they're literally showing the conquering of the Jewish people, and they have like, I think they have a menorah or something that they're carrying, like signifying that, haha, we beat them. And then they get kicked out.
okay.
And then there's a strange thing that's happening with Paul and the Romans in that there's a whole nother layer to this that I don't think we'll talk about much, but the Jews that stayed versus the Jews that left and then came back. And who out of that group counts more? Does one group count more? And like this reassimilation of Jewish folks that have left that land and come back. And it's like, there's all these strange cultural entanglements that are happening that are like, what do we do with all of this? And so Paul is trying to address some of that as well, which is like both how does God relate to all of this in a bigger picture, but also, hey, you over there, stop doing that. And we'll see some of that in less in Romans than in the other letters, but there are parts where he's like, stop doing that. And we'll read some of them and see them.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a relatively small percentage.
Like 1% or
I-
5%?
I don't know. I'd have to go look it up, but I just know it's very small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Rhetorical devices. So we've already talked about that a little bit. We'll talk about it more as we go, but like this thing where Paul, it happens, I want to say it's like Romans 3 or 4. And can I borrow your Bible for a sec?
Oh, sure.
See, if I had mine, I'd be able to pull it up right away because I know exactly where it is, but I can picture it in my head where it is. Okay, so chapter 2, verses 17. What about you? So he's specifically talking about you, one person. You call yourself a Jew. So it sounds like he's talking to a real Jewish person. You call yourself a Jew, you depend on the law and boast about God. You know what God wants you to do, and you have learned from the law to choose what is right. You are sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light for those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, and a teacher for the ignorant, blah, 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 blah. And then he starts bashing this person and says, you got it all wrong. Christians generally have read that as an indictment of all Judaism, of all Jews.
Mm.
What Paul is doing here is creating a straw man. Is there anybody here that doesn't know what a straw man is?
Kind of.
Okay, so a straw man is you create a fictitious person that is supposed to be like a caricature, a stereotype of a certain type of people,
Mm.
so that you can then knock it down. He's not talking about all Jews or any specific Jew. He's saying there's this type of Jewish person that's arrogant, and that's not okay. That doesn't mean they're separated from God. That doesn't mean they're not chosen anymore. But he's saying this type of Jewish person, you'll experience them, because he's talking to Gentiles, and they need to be more humble. But that doesn't mean that all of Judaism is no good. But you don't get that if you don't realize that he's creating a straw man and that he's doing this kind of strange dance. So there's a lot of these type of rhetorical devices, a lot of ways of writing that Paul does, or I guess technically, he's not writing, he's speaking, that we as readers now don't necessarily catch. We don't see it. And this is where a lot of scholarship has been done to look at outside of the New Testament. This stuff happens all the time. And these classical scholars see these things all the time, these rhetorical devices, and know them. And you can bring that scholarship in and say, oh, Paul's doing that too, which of course he was Greek and he
Yes.
learned
Okay.
all of these types of things that you learn at Greek school. So why would he not be using them? And so we'll talk about that as we go, some of these things that he does. And so I picked up this quote from a book that is I left everything in my car. I'll bring it next time. A lot of what we're talking about comes out of this book, but realistically, it's like all of this thing that's called The New Perspective on Paul, which started in the 60s, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but really took hold in like the 80s and 90s. And it's this rereading Paul in context and saying, oh, Paul was Jewish. How does that shape or reshape our understanding? But also Paul was Greek and had these things that he uses from the Greek world. How does that change our understanding? So one of the quotes is, the words are Paul's, but whose is the voice? Because at some times, like I said, it's kind of like he's a stand-up comedian where he's playing this person, but then another time he's playing this person, and it's like a fake person he's made. So it sounds like Paul's talking, but it's not really him, which is why at times people will say, I read Romans and it just feels like Paul's schizophrenic. Well, yeah, that's because he's speaking with multiple voices. You've got it. You just didn't realize that that's what's happening.
And it was very deliberate.
And it was very deliberate. Because at times he'll say something and it'll trip you up, and you'll be like, he'll say the exact opposite right after that. And you're like, why is he contradicting himself? Oh no, that's another person speaking back. It's just they're having like a dialogue, but we just read it as one person, as just Paul, but that's not what's happening. Okay. Translations, dictionaries, commentaries. We've talked about translations a little bit. I didn't talk about this on Monday, but dictionaries and lexicons. So the people who are translating, or
Wait a
like,
minute, you talked about this on Monday?
yeah, so there's a Monday night version of this that's once a month
Oh, thank you.
at 6 p.m. We're going to be able to look at things more closely because we're doing this weekly. That one's like a crash course. Like I cover everything that we did in a month in one night,
Mhm.
which I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work, but I'm going to try it out. So like, let's say I'm going to go translate something. I don't know every word. I don't know all of Greek. So I'll go look at a dictionary and say, oh, here's like a variation, like a variety of words that this word could mean in English, that this Greek word could mean. Here's the problem that we have. Some of those that are used the most often were literally written by Nazis in the 40s. Kittel is like a very common lexicon that people will use, and they don't realize it was literally written by a Nazi, which tells you it's probably skewed a little bit, right? Particularly when we're talking about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Super
Yeah.
problematic. Which is why when you read translations, you got to be super careful because it's baked in.
Yeah.
ideologies. It's baked in certain ways to approach texts.
Did Hitler have his people make a translation of the Bible?
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't think so.
Okay, so where,
He was more interested in like the Germanic history and
so,
like the myths of that, and that spoke to the people in a way so that he could create that's how he created this whole worldview of like we are better than everybody. He used like the Germanic myths.
so you're saying that his word choices, if this Greek word has 5 choices, on, in, above, below, 5
Right.
choices, the one that he picks is a Nazi version. Where are we likely to find that? In specific translations of the Bible, like the New Revised Standard Version, or
It,
or
generally,
just here and there?
it's how do I say this? It's almost like it's subconscious. So like you're not gonna see it be like, oh, clearly a Nazi wrote that. But you're gonna read through and you're gonna be like, oh, here's a different option, and we'll go through some of those, and here's a different option. Oh dang, like that completely changes what so like this word that we translate as faith. Faith in Jesus. There's another option which is faithfulness of Jesus, and we'll get into this. Does anybody know what a case language is?
Oh, what?
A case language? Diana, you probably know this.
CASE?
Yeah. So like German and Greek and those are the two that I usually name. There are other ones where it's like in English, you know how we have verbs and we will conjugate verbs.
Mhm.
They'll have different endings depending on who it relates to. In Greek, as well as in German, nouns do that as well. They decline. There's declension.
Oh,
So instead of having the word of does not exist in Greek. It's how the end of the noun is structured that tells you that it's a possessive.
oh, okay.
So like Yesu Christu, like the OU ending tells me that's genitive, which means it's a possessive, or they are doing the action. So like in Greek, you can literally have a sentence that can be in any order. The words can be in any order that you want, because the way in which the word is spelled tells you the role it plays in a sentence.
So if you make a mistake on your spelling paper,
It completely
It
changed. Yeah,
really
it
changes.
totally backs up a sentence. Yeah.
as a teacher, I can relate to that.
Yeah. So it's gonna come up in stuff like that where they're like, oh, like I'm gonna have it be faith in Jesus because that makes it more Christianized than faithfulness of Jesus, because then it's the saving acts of Jesus that are in a Jewish context.
Gotcha.
It
Okay.
rips it out of that world and puts it in a different world.
Okay.
So the the syntax doesn't matter as much in Greek?
Correct.
Okay.
You like literally you can have a sentence be in any order you want because each individual word tells you, is it the object or the subject? It tells you who's doing the action and who's receiving the action. So like you could say, Brian ran towards the table. I'm the subject. The table is a direct object because that's what I'm running towards. It's receiving, I'm going towards it. In
Right.
Greek, ending of the word table will tell you that that's it. So it could be table, run, Brian. And in English, we just assume, okay, the table's running towards Brian. But because of the way that Greek works is you can have it in any order and the ending tells you that I'm the one running, even though I'm at the end of the sentence, and the table is being what's run toward. And the reason why this matters also is because you can put it in any order you want, you can stress certain things. You can put certain things at the beginning of a sentence that say, you really need to pay attention to this word. It matters more than the rest of the other words. Before I move forward, I want to show you one thing that is in addition to all of this. I swear this matters. Trust me on this. So when I go to read Greek, this is what I see. And what you notice is there are verse numbers, there are punctuation, there is gaps between words. In the original Greek, none of that is the case. None of that exists. How do I go back so I can see not just that one thing? I found a really good, here we go. This is a perfect example. P45, which is like the earliest thing that we have. Holy moly, this is not what I wanted. Okay. Is it really not gonna work? Okay. I was able to do this much better on Monday. Can I do it here? Yeah, there you go. Oh. So what you see in this text on the right, do you see gaps between words?
No,
Yeah.
that's not children's writing.
Do you see gaps?
No.
No,
Do you see punctuation?
no.
No,
Do you see, they're called diacritical marks, which is like the
Accents.
accents, the tildes and stuff? Yeah. No. Ancient Greek, well, Koine Greek, the common Greek that the New Testament was written in, everything is just a stream of letters. So people have gone back and decided where sentences end and where they begin, and Paul's sentences are very hard to do that with. He is the master of run-ons. It's like a stream of thought that he just keeps going. And so translators have done the work to say, I'm going to assume that that ends there. That idea ends there. And then they eventually, later on, put verses. And then they change punctuation. And they do all of these things that aren't in the original text. The reason why that matters is because what we read in the New Testament in our Bibles is like completely manipulated, which isn't a bad thing. It makes it so that we have an easier job understanding what's going on. But, and this is the most important part of this probably, my professor that I originally read Romans with, who ended up being the dean at Drew, one of the first things she told us as we were reading Romans was, go through and take a Sharpie and cross out every heading. Because they weren't originally there, and they force you to read in a certain way, whether you even realize it or not. It will say things, and then you're going to assume that what comes next is about that, when it could be about something completely different.
Mm,
Even more so, those chapter breaks, since they weren't really there, it could be that an idea that's going along, Paul has an idea and he hasn't finished it yet, and then we've inserted a chapter break and we stop, but we needed to keep going to get the point, and we missed it because we stopped.
mm,
It's going to be very hard for me to resist the chapter breaks, and I'm going to try my best
okay.
as we're going through, but those are manufactured things that don't exist in the original Greek text.
Were the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Okay, I've got a question.
Yeah.
So,
Maybe
do you want to ask yours first?
No.
No, okay. I've got a question. There's an argument out there that if somebody translated it and they added those headings, that too was divinely inspired.
Wait, say
And
that-
I have not come up to, yeah, that too wasn't divinely inspired. So the Bible should be taken literally.
I mean,
I
that's all.
don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, no, that's a perspective on the Bible, that if it's divinely inspired and it's inerrant, then none of this matters. Everything I just said doesn't matter, which is fine for that group of folks. I was going to talk about this a little later, but there was a question around whether or not I was really a Methodist pastor because I'm not using a book for this, for us to follow along,
Mhm.
which I thought was funny. I got a laugh out of it. But the core of what I'm trying to do in a study like this is to use the quadrilateral. Is there anybody here that doesn't know what the okay,
Yeah.
so the Wesleyan quadrilateral is a way in which we think about our faith. And this happens on Sunday mornings, whether or not we realize we're doing it or not. George will do it in sermons and you won't realize he's doing it, but he is. So in Anglicanism, that's what John Wesley was. He was Anglican. You had like a tripod of three things of in the center, everything that was central was scripture, but then you also had reason and tradition. And you read the Bible, including your reason and tradition, and you kind of have like a tripod. And John Wesley comes along and he says, yeah, but our experience matters a lot. And it's going to shape the way in which we read the Bible. And so he adds that fourth layer. So quadrilateral.
Okay.
And so the idea is that as we go through, we're going to talk about history. We're going to talk about what was going on 2000 years ago. We're going to talk about tradition. So like, how has this been interpreted over time? We're going to talk about our own experiences and say, okay, my experience of God tells me that can't be right. And it's okay to do that because we're Methodists and we can say, either I'm reading this wrong or Paul is wrong. Something's happening here and I don't know what to do, but I know that my experience says no. And then scripture is central and that's what we're focusing on. That's what we're working with. And so
I wanted to ask you, is there a translation of the Bible that you recommend that's like pre-Nazi that you think is maybe the best translation?
NRSV is post, but it's pretty good generally, and that's just the one that we use. Like it's the ones that are in the pews, because of the group of people that work together. It's the Council of Churches did it, and there's a new version of the NRSV that I don't remember. It's not the new. Can't be the NNRSV.
I remember reading about that once.
I can't remember what it's called, but I read part of it and I actually was not impressed with the changes that they made because it didn't really incorporate new scholarship. And I was like, that's the whole point, people.
Yeah.
But yeah, NRSV I would say is likely the best. It's the one that I'll be working with. But as we go, I'll be pointing out, oh, we have options for this word. We have options the way that this sentence is structured, and it kind of changes how we think about it. So we'll be able to play around with it some. Yeah. Questions? Did that answer the question? Kind of.
Yeah, you did answer it.
I'm typing a question in right now.
Okay. Open chat.
Is the what you're calling the quadratic, the quadrilateral, is that not the same as the 4 pillars of Methodism?
I think that's the same. I don't know. What's the 4 pillars of Methodism?
I think it is.
I would assume it is, but then there's also Wesley's do no harm, do good, and stay in love with God, which might be the 3 pillars of Methodism. I don't really know.
Well, I know reason is one of the pillars, so that's
Oh,
why.
then yes, then absolutely, this is the 4 pillars of Methodism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And reason has been understood differently over time. So like you could use reason in terms of like science and how science relates to the Bible, but also our own intellectual reason. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I know people that, question why I go to church because they're big thinkers, and that I tell them that reason is one of the pillars, 4 pillars, and
But
then
it's not the only one.
no, then they're very interested after.
Yeah. Yeah, and the quadrilateral is very important to Methodism, but also just our faith, even though we don't think about it. That's the reason why the first time I stepped into Methodist church, I was like, oh, I can work with this. Because I didn't grow up going to church. My parents were anti-establishment hippies that my mom would tell me the church exists to take your money, which is kind of true. I just make the argument, okay, but what do they then do with that money?
Exactly.
If it's good, then it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I forgot where I was going with that. That's okay.
That's okay.
I'm
Well,
tired.
that it made you comfortable with.
That's right.
the Church because of reason.
Right, and and experience, and it was years later that somebody explained the quadrilateral, and I was able to think back to that and be like, and that's why it was
Yeah.
despite the quadrilateral not being named, that's what was happening. It made me feel like my experience matters, other people's experience matters,
Yeah.
and how we talk about our faith and think about the Bible and reason and all of these other things. Now, I had a professor once tell me that it's the quadrilateral, not the equilateral,
Oh,
meaning each four of those things do not hold the same weight. So the idea being traditionally, it's that scripture holds the most weight and those other things are used to think about or think with scripture. And my argument is, but scripture doesn't exist outside of our experience. Like, we always will bring things to scripture, and that's going to shape the way that we read scripture. So I'm like, I don't think it's as simple as saying, oh, it's not the equilateral, it's the quadrilateral. I think it's more complex than that, but more Methodisty people than me will argue and say no. But
yeah.
By the way, the equilateral quadrangle is a rhombus. Matter of fact. Sorry, the mathematician is just.
All right, thank you. Okay.
So I did, when it get back, so what you showed us with the original Greek writing and it all runs together, how did the Greeks at that time interpret it? Did they have problems interpreting that? I mean, where things break or?
No, because it's kind of like similar to, for example, if we look at any Asian culture, any language that has characters instead
Yeah.
of letters, like they just know it. They just knew it. Like they could look at it and they knew by default where things stopped and ended, particularly because of the way in which the words, like their endings. So they're like, okay, I have enough. I have a verb. I have a noun. I have a direct object and an object. I have all these things, and then they're like, that's what that means.
Yeah, I got
They're able to structure it.
it. Yeah.
In my head, it doesn't make sense. I have the same question. I'm like, how did they get it? But they did. Because that's just what they knew. That's what they were brought up with. Also, the majority of people, large majority of people, were illiterate.
Hmm. Okay, right. So it was spoken.
So they were hearing this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
rather than reading
yeah. And the literacy rate was like drastic. It depends on where you were, of course, in and at what point in time, but like it was drastically low, like 10 to 15%, I think. I should know that better, but
Yeah.
generally that's not my interest in terms of scholarship, that type of
Yeah.
stuff. But I just know it was really, really low.
But Paul was a very educated person.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Which is why if you go to translate his stuff, it's terrible. It's so hard to
Well,
translate.
This is a little off of what we're talking about, but not. My understanding is that when the first Bibles were published, Gutenberg, that created for many people who'd learned to read kind of the fundamentalism, because instead of listening, because when you listen to the text, you get it differently than when you read it and take it very literal. That's always interested me.
Yeah, so there's this other aspect of that too, in that we have a tendency to think, oh, Martin Luther started the Reformation. No. The Gutenberg Bible did, because all of a sudden it was able to be mass produced and everybody had access to it, and then more people could learn how to read because there was more resources to read. It's like a both and. It's like that step having been taken, all of a sudden there just was much more accessibility. It's kind of like today. It's like 30 years ago, not everybody knew how to use a computer. Pretty much everybody, not everybody, but pretty much everybody in the US does, because almost everybody has access to a computer at some point.
I'm going to make an assumption that when the Gutenberg Bible was printed and those people who could afford it bought one, it was okay for a woman to learn how to read because she was reading the Bible.
Again, it's
Where's-
where and when, but that's not an answer.
Yeah.
Like a question I can answer, but that's a logical
Yeah,
conclusion to
that
me.
there would be no necessity for her to learn how to read. And then this Bible comes along and it's, oh, yeah, we want you to learn that. And so accidentally they allowed her to learn how to read. I just think that's a very distinct possibility in the patriarchy society that was. Anyway,
And
that's off subject.
well, and there's also this kind of strange complexity of we have a tendency to think of the ancient world. So like, let's put ourselves back 2,000 years ago in the time of Jesus. And we have a tendency to think, oh, it was so patriarchal. Women had no power. They had no ability to accumulate wealth or resources. That just it wasn't true. It wasn't common, but we have all of these documents that show that women owned land, women owned businesses, that they were like head of households, and it's just we don't hear about those as much. Well, there's probably a reason we don't hear about those as much. It's because conservatives don't want us to hear those stories, right? They don't want to be like, oh yeah, that actually was part of. But if you read Romans, literally the people that were in charge and the people that were bankrolling Paul were women. And we'll see that later at the end. But there's both like the larger society, which generally showed that women had no power, but also you had these little pockets. So there could be a pocket where a woman had a Gutenberg Bible and could read it. I know
Yeah.
that's like that, like
Yeah.
hundreds and hundreds of years later,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
same kind of situation. I was thinking, and I want to get feedback, 10 to 11:30. Is that a reasonable amount of time for folks? Is that too long or too short?
It's fine for me. but-
It's fine for me, but I have a dentist appointment on Beach Boulevard at 11:45.
So you're gonna head out like,
So
11.
11:25.
okay. So we'll try to wrap up at 11:30, which means we're not gonna get through everything that I wanted to. There will probably be, so next week we'll go back to this slideshow and finish it off, and then the week after that, we'll probably start with Romans.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions before I keep going? I really
Oh,
hope,
I have to get out of here at 11:15, so
okay,
you guys finish at 11:30, fine.
okay. And I'm gonna send out this slideshow to everybody just so you have access to it. And that clearly I'm like adding to the words and adding to it, but it gives you kind of like a baseline of, oh, these are some of the things we talked about. I hope you came with your seatbelts on, because I know this is like a wild ride at the beginning. Reader positionality. What I mean by that is everybody comes to the biblical text with a different background and from a different perspective and from a different place. Also, I could make the argument that all of us here reading right now or meeting right now are part of the dominant class in the United States. If we were to kind of take what was happening 2,000 years ago and then bring it to now, the US is kind of basically the Roman Empire, the equivalent of the Roman Empire, and we are a part of that. And we benefit from that. So when we come to the Bible, we come with that. And there are people all over the world that don't come from that read this type of stuff and see something very different because of where they're coming from. So we have to both recognize that, but also realize that we have a responsibility, which is the next bullet point of we have to be careful of the way in which we think about things and read things, because we have our own backgrounds of both in certain ways marginality. Is that a word? Sure.
Mhm.
I'm gonna accept that that's a word. And also like we come from a place of power. Paul did too. As a Jew, he wasn't exactly powerful, but also as somebody who was learned, who went through the education system, was also powerful. So he kind of had this middle space. But we also have to think about like, what about the folks that are in Rome that are receiving this letter? Where is their positionality? Where are they coming from?
Mhm.
That's also a part. All of those things, we have a responsibility to be cautious. To come to the Bible with caution and say there are things that I might understand a certain way that come just from where I am, and that's okay. It's that experience part of the quadrilateral, but we also have to just recognize it and name it. There's also this thing of positionality that we are 2,000 years removed from when Paul was speaking these words and then they're being written down. So then we have this quote: "We can never penetrate behind Paul's words to his inner thoughts or his real intentions." We just can't get to what Paul actually meant, but we can try. And it's our duty to try to do it in a way that is just, that is, takes into account both the ancient context, but where we're coming from too.
And it's okay if we can't.
Yeah.
We're doing the best we can.
You do the best you can and you recognize that we can't get it right, which is different from where like a Baptist person might come and say, I can figure out exactly what the Bible means. No, we have a role in this.
Mhm.
And we just have to accept that. And so for some people, that's really hard to be okay with. Inside and outside of Methodism. And that's okay. And there are going to be times that we're just grappling and it's just like, it's kind of uncomfortable, but we just kind of roll with it. And yeah, that's why that last question I think is really important of how does this relate to our faith? Because then we can reflect on some of that as well. Another quote: "The meaning of a text," so a letter, a poem, a commentary, whatever it may be, "never arises from a text in isolation, but instead in a dynamic interaction between readers and the text." We are always doing a dance with what we're reading. We're always bringing something to it. It's always affecting us in some way. So then it is shaping us at the same time that we're going back into it again. So it's like, yes, you come with your experience. Part of your experience is having read that Bible that you just read. And so there's always this strange dance that's happening. Talk about quadrilateral. The does not mean. That does not mean. I found a mistake. That does not mean we ignore the historical context. We just turn to it cautiously.
Mhm.
It's important to recognize that they're in a different world and that we can try our best to understand what that world was like. And we can say, maybe that historical context that has been constructed in the modern world was off. And that we can alter it and say, oh, there's a different way to think about that ancient context.
I was really looking forward to the Holy Land tour that was a possibility before everything happened,
Yeah.
to help with that difference, to understand the geography and some of the history and
Yeah. So those that don't know, Mesa Verde, the pastor there, Matt Sargent, was planning a trip to the Holy Land, and then all hell broke loose in Gaza, and so that got canceled. Yeah. First century Judaism, don't read it on our terms, but theirs. We'll get into that more. We'll talk about that more. There's one really key thing that is going to come up, I think, on the next slide that we'll talk about that has to do with how we as modern Christians think about Judaism and how the Jewish folk 2,000 years ago thought about themselves. And there is likely a very large disconnect there. And it completely alters the way in which we think about what Paul is talking about and our own theology. And we have to kind of grapple with, well, if that's true, these are all hypotheticals. If that is true, then what happens? How does it change our faith? We already talked about Christianity as a Jesus movement. Sure. Paul's the apostle to Gentiles. We talked about that. Okay, cool. Yes, it is the next. So Bonnie left, and I'll talk to Bonnie about this later at a certain point, or I can have her come on. I'm recording this so she can go watch it later. Covenantal nomism, and this is going to be really important throughout this whole reading of Romans. And I'm going to do my best to explain it, but I'll probably do a poor job. But hopefully enough will get through that you'll be like, okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense. In the modern world today, thinking about Christians in general, how do we think about Jewish law? What is the Jewish law?
I got Jewish people in my family, but they're not that observant. So that I've been to temples,
Okay.
Well, I think that I think of that like twofold. One is the Ten Commandments,
Right,
you
okay.
know, the big things. And then there's what I think of not, in my opinion, not really relevant to religion, which is, you know, what they eat and.
All
you
these
know,
other
I mean,
things,
they're-
right?
600
Dietary
laws.
restrictions, yeah, all those laws, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah,
What is
If
the
you're-
role of those? Go ahead.
if you're, reform, or if you're very, very strict on the laws where you can't even go past the yellow tape on Saturday around Beverly Hills.
Right. And so what do Christians oftentimes think of those laws? The second group that we're talking about.
I think
Right.
they're arbitrary.
And that they're no longer useful or needed to
Yeah.
be followed.
But I do think some of them, like way back when, it did make sense, you know, because they didn't have refrigeration and I could see.
Don't eating pork and.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, so it's this thing of survival,
Mhm.
of saying, okay, this random thing happened. We don't really understand the science behind it, but we do know that we're not supposed to do that again, so we're gonna make it a law in relation to God so that people don't do that again.
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's a survival tactic, and that's fine. But I think what I was getting at is a lot of times Christians will say, those are burdens. Those laws are burdens for Jewish people. Like, it's just ridiculous that they have to do all these things, right? It just seems crazy that they have to do these. They can't go past the yellow line. They can't do all these things. Like, there's just too much. And also a lot of times Christians will think about it as like, Jews believe that you have to do all of the laws perfectly in order to get into heaven. And that's why Jesus had to be perfect, because he had to fulfill all of the laws. And he's the only one that's ever been able to do it, and that's why Jesus is special. Cool, great. But that's not necessarily the way Jews thought about it or think about it today. So there's a timing problem here, in that we have a tendency to think you have to do the things, you have to do all of these laws, and then what comes next on the timeline is that you are saved. And Jewish folks don't think about it that way. For them, it's they were the chosen people and they were saved by God. They didn't do anything to earn it. What we in Christianity would call grace. God's grace happened in that they were chosen. And then the law came. And the law is not a burden, but rather it's thought about as these are the ways in which you can enact God's love and justice in the world. And then other people will see that and they'll see how good it is, and then they will come to God.
Mm. So is their version of living the word of,
And it's not a burden, but rather it's a gift.
yeah, yeah.
It's a gift to be able to do the things to allow people to experience God in the world. Not a burden, a gift that is it's the way I term it is a just response to God's grace.
And that's what nonism means.
So covenantal nomism, so covenant, we know that
Yeah.
covenant. So within Judaism, you had the first covenant of God with Abraham, and then they become the chosen people. And then nomism is law. So it's this idea of what's the relationship of law to a covenant. And so E.P. Sanders is making the argument that within ancient Judaism, it was they did the law because it's their just response to God's grace. They're living out.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, to me.
And in Christianity, a lot of times people are like, oh, I was saved by Jesus. I said the words and I'm good now. But in Methodism, no, that's not what we do. We say there's prevenient grace, which is the grace that we experience before we really know who God is. There's justifying grace in which we are saved by accepting Jesus or whatever, however you want to talk about it. And then after that, there's sanctifying grace. So it's the grace of God that allows us to love others, love ourselves, and love God better. In this thing that we're talking about, the law within Judaism is kind of equivalent to our understanding of sanctifying grace. They're kind of similar in a way,
Okay.
in that our just response to God's grace is to do good in the world.
And I would say a lot of Jews that I have known have done really a whole lot of charity work.
Because that's the just response to God.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, helping other people. I've been like super.
And-
excited about that.
And then they call you a mensch.
Sure. So, but you see that there's a timing issue in that doing the law is a just response to God's grace, but if you don't do the law, it doesn't negate the thing that came before.
Mhm,
The chosenness is still there.
mhm.
So Paul in that chapter 2 stuff doesn't say you're an arrogant Jew and now you're out. He says you can do better and you
Yeah.
should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are two very different things that are happening.
Mhm.
And we'll talk about that more when we read that passage in particular. And then it gets a little more complicated with the tree metaphor, but
Well,
The-
actually, it is complicated, I'm sure, but it's also simple. If somebody gives you a gift and you appreciate it, you write them a thank you note.
yep, you live it out and you write them a thank you note. Exactly. You do something with it. So the next bullet point of community over individual matters in terms of that framework. So we in the modern world are very, there's a term for it, but I can't, like individualism, like we're individual
Mhm.
focused.
Mhm.
Everything is about the individual, my
Me,
individual
me, me.
rights, my individual salvation. That's not really the way necessarily that the ancient world thought about things. They thought about it in terms of community, tribe, or whatever, and people groups. Which is why as we go through this, we're going to see Paul doesn't talk about individuals almost at all. He's always talking about people groups. He's trying to figure out Jews and everybody else. And so in this framework of salvation and covenantal nomism, all of this thing with covenantal nomism is based on people groups. So it's not individual Jews that are saved, but the Jewish people as a whole are saved when they are chosen. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very outside of the way we generally talk about things. So it's like, Jesus is my personal savior. And 2,000 years ago, they'd be like, well, that doesn't make sense. They'd just be like, no, okay.
Yeah.
But they will say, Jesus is a really good example to follow, so we're going to do what he did.
Yeah.
So as a community, we're going to follow the same teachings and do the things that he did. You can go now. That was like the main, really the
Okay.
main thing for
I have to make a comment. I don't know if I can come next week. I got put on a bail for a job, an acting job.
Sweet.
And the costume fittings are the 14th and 15th.
I'm always going to try to be recording it so that you can go back and watch.
Oh, good. Okay. And I won't know until the night before. So I have to wait a week until I find out. So maybe I'll see you next week.
At some point, you need to potentially talk to Matt Hambrick, the pastor at Costa Mesa First, because he's just starting gig work.
Oh, really?
Yeah, with
Oh,
that.
yeah,
He's
give-
just
give
kind
him
of
my
playing around
info.
with it.
Give him
So,
my info. Have him call me.
yeah, he's got like a casting thing that he's going to at some point. I don't remember when. But yeah.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Nice to meet you. Okay. And the
It
last word-
almost feels like this is a good point to stop.
Yeah,
but
well,
I-
tell us about the last word though. Just give us like a little bit of
Yeah, I hate this word
okay.
because it's said different ways depending on what you're talking about. So that is, I'm going to mess it up. Eschatology. And then there's an eschatological worldview, which is different than eschatology. It's said different. It drives me nuts. But anyway, the meaning of that word basically means end times. So Paul thought he was living in the end times. He thought the world was ending and it was imminent. Like right now, it's about to happen.
Mhm.
We have the benefit of saying, we've had another 2,000 years and that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
But if you think about in the world today, these groups that think the world is ending right now, one, they're usually pretty extreme. Two, they usually have kind of wacky ideas. I don't know, there was a third, but I don't know what it is. But really, all of those are like dependent on the fact that the world's about to end. So what Paul is talking about is going to be clearly influenced by the fact that he thinks things are ending right now. And that will matter as we go through, because if you think about like, if the world's about to end,
Yeah.
why should Gentiles be circumcised? It doesn't matter. This is also why at some point he says like, if you're married, stay married. If you're not married, then don't get married.
Yeah,
Well, if the world's about to end, that's why,
Oh, I
because it
see.
doesn't matter.
right, okay,
Why get married
yeah.
if it's over?
Yeah,
It's
you're
already
right,
over.
that was puzzling to me. I do remember thinking that thought, that was a little strange.
Right, and we'll get into this later, but I want to find. I'm skipping ahead. We'll talk all about this next week.
Okay, yeah. this is quite good stuff.
Um,
Okay, I got it, you can,
Well, I just want to bring this up because this will be important later. Okay, you do see that, good. Anybody want to read?
I'll read it.
I can't, hold it, wait.
Zechariah, okay.
Yeah,
Okay, Zechariah 2 verses 11 through 13. You ready?
yeah, I think so.
Many nations shall join themselves to the Lord on that day, and shall be my people, and I will dwell in your midst. And you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. The Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem. Be silent, all people, before the Lord, for he has roused himself from his holy dwelling.
So there's something really important about this verse for Paul that influences the way he's thinking. Who is joining with the Lord?
Many nations.
Does it say Jews?
Nope.
So, at the end times, many nations are going to join with the Lord, are going to come to God. So Paul's thinking, not everybody's converting to Judaism, but rather they're staying who they are as these other people groups and coming to God. And if the world's ending right now, we don't need people converting to Judaism. We don't need people circumcising themselves because the world's ending right now. And God has promised that they will come as they are. And this is in Zechariah, but it's in other places too, but also was just kind of like the general understanding at the time of all peoples will come to God as they are. And if the ending is right now, then we just need to run with that. Where Peter's walking around and saying, everybody needs to circumcise, can't eat any defiled meats, blah, blah, blah. Like everybody has to be Jewish. And Paul's like, no, that doesn't make sense because the ending is right now. So why would we need to do that? And it would be turning our back on God's promise of this. It's called the ingathering of the nations.
well, why did Paul think the world was ending? That was just their culture.
That
at
was
the
just,
time?
yeah.
Huh,
I mean, why do people think the world is ending now? They just
yeah.
do.
Okay,
And they're wrong.
okay.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Although at times it kind of feels like it's ending now. But that's a whole different thing. Yeah. So as we're reading and going,
Very interesting.
yeah, and really what it does is it relates to that
Okay,
framework, that covenantal nomism framework of like,
Yeah,
God has chosen everybody else. But over here, you have all these people that God has promised that they'll be incorporated in, and it's ending right now. So how is that going to happen? And his answer again is Jesus. And we'll get there.
Okay.
Cool. We did a little bit of Bible work today.
yeah.
Not much,
okay, yes, you
but-
did.
Well, this is what I was hoping to get out of this Bible study, is this background stuff that I just don't know as a layperson.
Yeah. And this type of stuff, honestly, this is what I studied. And so I don't know if George could do this either. He might not be able to. Like I can't remember when he was in seminary, but I think a lot of this came through after he was in seminary. And
I
so-
enjoyed it. I have to go because Karen's Mazzatelli's bring Ryan here to take a shower.
Okay. Say hi for me.
I will.
Ryan
Okay.
loves my hair, so you know.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. See ya.
Bye.
Say hi to Karen for me too.
I will.
Okay, what time is it? 11:32. Perfect. Is there anybody that'd be willing to close us in prayer? I know there's only 4 of us left, but I'm willing to. Going once, going twice. Okay, I got it. Thank you, God, for this time together. For the time to explore your word again. To think about our faith tradition with new eyes. And to really just delve into something that a lot of us may haven't done before. Continue to be with us throughout this study as it moves forward and throughout our days. Amen.
When did you graduate from seminary?
So I got my MA in 2011. Then I worked full time on campus for a while in administrative roles, and then I started again in 2015 with my PhD, and I graduated and I defended in April of 22.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah,
So
you're
I-
fresh out of school.
And it was crazy. So you have the PhD process, which is completely separate from the ordination process.
Oh,
And I started them at different times, but I was commissioned. So I walked in graduation in May and then I was commissioned in June.
okay.
Like everything just kind of converged at the same time. And I went I went from Brian to Reverend Dr. Brian in a month period. I'm like, sure, great. Yeah. Not that it really makes any difference, but yeah.
Have a good week.
Yes.